A DAC is a crucial part of any high-performance audio system, but what is it exactly? Why do you need one? How can you choose one? And once you have one, how do you use it to maximize the sound quality of your system? Let's talk about all that. DAC stands for Digital to Analog Converter, and that tells us exactly what it does. It takes the data stored in music files on, say, your computer or your phone, or maybe coming from a streaming service like Spotify, and it turns those files into music we can actually listen to. After all, we can't listen to the data, we need it delivered to us as sound waves. The DAC acts like a translator in that regard. It understands digital files and can relay them to us as the sound waves that we understand. But that's the simple part. Why we need them starts to become a bit more complicated because you already have a bunch of them. Your TV, computer, gaming console, maybe your phone, maybe a music streamer, all have DACs in them already. Anything that has an RCA output, an XLR output, or a headphone jack like a 3.5mm output will have a DAC already built in. Problem solved. Not exactly. In the same way that your phone can take photos, but isn't a professional camera, a dedicated DAC can provide higher sound quality than the built-in versions in devices that are designed primarily for other purposes. So asking why you need a DAC is probably not quite the right question. The question is more why you might need a better one. The exception to all of this is when you have a device like recent Samsung phones that don't even have a headphone output. With those, you do need a DAC. You don't already have one, at least not one you can access. And so to start to make this clearer, let's talk briefly and as simply as I can put it about the different types of DACs and what separates them. The most common types of DACs are chip-based DACs. They use a silicon chip to do all of the processing. Lots of companies make DAC chips, but the most common and well-known are the options like ESS, AKM, Cirrus Logic, and Burr Brown, which are actually now owned by Texas Instruments. There are cheap DAC chips, like those used in, say, TVs or phones with headphone sockets, with a few exceptions. And then there are more expensive DAC chips, like those used in premium hi-fi DACs. And yes, this does get a little bit confusing, because I'm talking about the chips as being DACs, as well as the whole component being a DAC. I'll explain a bit more about that once we get some of the fundamentals in place. Most DAC chips use an approach known as delta sigma or sigma delta, depending on who you talk to. We won't go into the depths of how that works today because that's enough for a whole video all on its own. For the sake of this discussion, all we need to know is it's a very effective way of translating the data into the sound waves, but it requires a fair bit of processing along the way, and then that processing requires some fancy filtering to remove the noise generated by the processing. And the quality of those filters has a significant impact on the sound quality of the DAC chip. However, most modern DAC chips, possibly all modern DAC chips, do a good enough job of that filtering, an excellent job of that filtering, so that they all sound pretty great. There are a few examples though that do an even better job and separate themselves from the rest of the pack. For example, AKM released not that long ago the AK4499 and AK4191 DAC chip combo. These two work together as a pair. That combination and the way it processes and filters the sound results, in my opinion at least, in a better sound than many other DAC chips. As I said before though, going much deeper than that would be a whole video of its own, so let's leave Delta Sigma DAC chips just about there. Another approach to digital to analog conversion is DSD, which stands for Direct Stream Digital. As the name sort of suggests, DSD is focused on a more direct or simple path from the digital encoding of the file through to the sound waves that we actually hear. And as a result, some will tell you that DSD DACs produce a more lifelike or analog musical experience. Others will tell you that it's less accurate in some ways. I'm not going to make a case either way here because it's all subjective. What I can say here though is that in my experience, DSD DACs will often sound a bit smoother and a bit more spacious than a Delta Sigma approach. It's up to you to work out if that's what you want, and if the characteristics of, say, Delta Sigma suit your system, your room and your setup and your preferences better than, say, Delta Sigma. And now we've got 3 more different DAC types to mention, but don't worry if this is starting to feel overwhelming, because it all starts to get simpler when you realize that they're actually just all trying to do the same job. All of these approaches are trying to just reproduce an accurate version of the sound waves, they're just going about it different ways. And more importantly, there's no right or wrong approach, there's just which one you enjoy. And next approach we're going to talk about is multibit decoding. That term can get a bit misleading and overgeneralized if we start to dig too deep, but I'm going to stick with it as a summary or category to encapsulate DACs from those like Shit Audio and also the DAC chips from companies like Bird Brown. What I'm calling a multibit DAC here is a conversion approach that does a bit less processing than Delta Sigma. There's still some conversion required, of course, because it's going from digital to a sound wave, but there's less of it here. Like DSD, some people will tell you that a multibit approach results in a sound that is more lifelike and more natural sounding, and once again, others will tell you it's less accurate and precise. And again, there's no right or wrong here. Just the question of which one you prefer when you try them. Very generally speaking, the multibit DACs that I've tried from brands like Shit Audio, and iFi is a brand that uses Bird Brown quite a lot, those DACs will often sound a bit richer and a bit more full-bodied than Delta Sigma equivalents. But that's far from a hard and fast rule, and again, there's no right and wrong. And so now let's take a very small step to the final type of DAC approach that I want to talk about here, and that's R2R DACs. R2R and multibit DACs are fairly similar in their approach, but they do things a little bit differently. And in the case of R2R DACs, they either use a whole bunch of resistors in a chip or laid out on a larger circuit board to do the decoding of the digital signal and turn it into the sound waves. This is how the very first DACs ever made worked, and they were soon replaced by Delta Sigma because back then there were some issues with R2R DACs. These days though, there are new technologies that can make R2R DACs far more accurate and far cheaper to make than once upon a time. And so you're probably seeing a big trend here, and I am going to keep saying it. There is no correct approach to DAC design, at least not according to anything I've ever seen or heard. Different manufacturers will have their reasons for why they think their approach is right, but it's a subjective hobby and different people like different types of sound. And then to add to that, different DACs of the same approach, say two different R2R DACs, can also sound different. And so it's not just a matter of choosing the type of DAC you want, whether it's R2R, Multibit, DSD, or Delta Sigma, because every brand and then every model within that brand can still have its own sound. And so with that in mind, choosing a DAC comes down to just a few key decisions. Firstly, you might identify that you do have a preference for a certain approach to DAC design. R2R, Delta Sigma, DSD, or Multibit. Next, you might find a brand and model that uses the approach that you like and, very importantly, sounds the way that you like. And then also, you'll need to think about whether it fits the next criteria, which is, does it have the features and the connectivity that you need? And this leads us to the final question that I posed at the beginning of this video. Once you have a DAC, how do you use it to get the most out of your audio system? Well, the first and most obvious answer to that question is you connect it properly. That might sound simple enough until you realize that most DACs accept multiple different types of inputs. Your source might limit you to maybe USB only or maybe optical only, but let's talk through all the common connection types just to help make sense of it. Almost every modern DAC will offer USB input, either as a USB-B or USB-C socket generally, and they'll also generally have SPDIF connections. These were the only connections available on the very first DACs ever made, and those DACs were made by Sony and Philips. As such, SPDIF stands for Sony Philips Digital Interface Format, and it comes in two forms, either as a single RCA or sometimes a BNC connection, and or as an optical connection. Both of these are technically SPDIF, but sometimes you'll see the optical one called Toslink, and that's because the connection type was invented, or at least popularized, I'm not sure, by Toshiba, and Toslink stands for Toshiba Link. Once we move beyond those three basics, we start to get a lot more variation in what each DAC might have. Sometimes you'll see a connection called AES, which is made with a 3-pin XLR socket. AES is sometimes called EBU, and it's a professional version of the SPDIF connection that uses the same transmission protocols, but does it through a balanced connection. Again, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of that here because I want to keep this as simple as possible. Another connection type you'll commonly see on DACs, and thankfully the D90 discrete that I've got here, the review's coming up, subscribe if you want to see it. Thankfully the D90 discrete has all of these on it. That's an I2S connection. Most commonly, I2S is carried through an HDMI socket like on here, but it's not an HDMI connection in the sense that you can't connect your TV or your gaming console directly to that because they're speaking different languages. Sometimes you might also see I2S carried through an RJ45 network style socket, but that's generally less common to see. And that brings me to the final inputs that we commonly see on DACs in the form of Bluetooth Wi-Fi, and network connections. Technically, those are all still digital connections, but they do work a bit differently from everything else we've spoken about. And so before we get too caught up in the wheres and the whys and the hows of what each of these connections does and how it does it, let's just focus on what we need to know for you to choose which one's best for your system. And once again, the initial answer is it depends. Firstly, of course, you can only connect to what you have available. So if you're using a computer that's only got USB out, that's what you're using. If you have multiple options though, let's talk now through the basic pros and cons of each connection type to help you choose. USB is possibly the best choice in many cases. The reason for this is that it allows the DAC to handle all of the timing of the processing of the signal. And timing is very important to get accurate sound waves coming out at the other end of the process. One of the problems with USB though can be noise. Some computers can be very noisy, and that's able to go through the cable into your DAC and mess up all of that timing accuracy that I just spoke about. The challenge here is that you might only be able to find out what your USB output from your computer is like by giving it a go. The good news is that there are devices on the market that will help filter out that noise. But again, that's also a topic for a different video. If you know you've got noisy USB, or for some reason you don't have USB or you don't want to use it, then we can turn to talking about SPDIF connections. Because sometimes SPDIF can be better, and sometimes it can be worse. Toslink connections are fantastic because they carry light and not electricity. That means that electrical noise, the stuff that could have gone through a USB cable, can't go through an optical cable. So using optical can be an excellent way to isolate your DAC from a noisy source device like a computer. Unfortunately, SPDIF connections, whether they're optical or coaxial using the RCA connections, those rely on the timing coming from the source device. In other words, that could be from your computer, your gaming console, or your television. Because many devices that we're going to be connecting to may not have been designed with pristine audio reproduction in mind, their timing circuits are often inferior to a dedicated audiophile DAC. And that's again where USB can be a preferable connection type, unless it's noisy. And so you might be thinking now that RCA-based or what we call coaxial-based SPDIF must be dreadful. After all, it's a wired connection that can carry noise, and it's using the timing coming from the source device. Well, just to keep us on our toes, I sometimes find that the RCA or BNC-based SPDIF connection is actually better than optical or USB. This is the adventure that is digital audio. It's why each decision should come back to a little bit of trial and error and what sounds best in your particular setup. And don't worry, because very few modern DACs will sound bad from any input. They'll just sound even better from some compared to others. And so let's now quickly wrap up the other inputs that are a bit less common, with AES/EBU being a very good choice when it's available, but it does still rely on the timing of your source device, and that may mean that USB again could be a preferable choice. However, if your source device is something like a high-end music streamer, it might have a better set of clocks than your DAC does, and that's where optical, coaxial, or AES could be the best choice. Another option that can be great is I2S, because it's similar to USB in the sense that the timing can be done by the DAC. Sometimes you even get a choice like on the Live Harmony DAC. It will let you decide if you want to use the timing circuit in the DAC or the timing circuit in the source. In many of my tests with DACs that do have I2S, I almost always find it to be the best sounding input. But there are still no guarantees because there's no one standard for I2S, so your mileage may vary. If we talk now about Bluetooth, it's wonderfully convenient, but it's also the worst sounding input you can choose. And that's because for the transmission of Bluetooth to work, the original digital files have to be compressed, which means they're throwing away data. It's not a full quality copy of the file that arrives at your DAC. That's probably going to change in the future, but for now, Bluetooth is clearly the worst possible connection you can use from a sound quality point of view. And that brings us finally to Wi-Fi and or network connections. Not too many DACs offer this, and those that do are technically also streaming devices as well. When available, this is a fantastic way to connect your DAC because a full copy of the file is being delivered to the device, and then it's doing all of the processing and decoding within the device itself. Whereas when we're transmitting through SPDIF, USB, I2S, there is a level of processing being done at the source device to convert the file into the format that needs to go through that protocol. In the case of network and Wi-Fi, it's just literally handing the file as it is through to the source device for it to then unpack it and turn it into the audio. The only drawback with network connections, whether wired or wireless, is that you can't connect and control network-based DACs without something like a computer or a smartphone or tablet running a specific app. In other words, you can't watch a movie or play a game on a gaming console or a computer and have the sound go via the network into that sort of DAC if it's network connected. It's great for music playback, but that's about it. And so there's a rundown of all the different connection types and a complete lack of definitive answers as to which one's best. Once again, it all comes down to trying what's convenient and available for you and seeing what you like the most with your specific gear and your personal tastes. Remember though, that on a modern device, any connection type is likely to sound very good, so don't stress too much. Another way to look at it is that convenience is often the best choice because it's going to get you listening to your music quicker. And so you've connected your DAC to your source device, and now you need to get the sound out of the DAC and into your amplifier, your speakers, your headphones, etc. A pure DAC, like this one, will only have a couple of options as outputs. These outputs are on the back of most DACs, and will generally be limited to RCA outputs and XLR outputs. These outputs are designed to connect to a preamp, a speaker amp, or a headphone amp. And as I said, we've got the RCA connections, which come in pairs, left and right for stereo, and these are called single-ended or unbalanced connections. And then we've got the 3-pin XLR connections, which also come in pairs, again, stereo left and right. And those are called balanced connections. Balanced versus unbalanced or single-ended is a reference to the internal structure of the wires and how the signal is transmitted and processed at either end. In short, balanced connections are designed to remove any noise that might be picked up by the cable on its journey from the DAC to the amplifier, preamplifier, etc. And that's because a cable can act like an antenna, but it's generally only an issue for very long cables. In other words, balanced versus unbalanced connections aren't particularly relevant in home audio, where your cable runs are probably less than 2 meters. However, the internal design of the devices can vary significantly depending on how the manufacturer designed the balanced and unbalanced circuits. Guess where this is going? If a DAC has both balanced and unbalanced connections, sometimes those outputs sound equivalent. Other times, one's better than the other. The best way to decide is to take a listen. However, there is a little bit more guidance I can give you on this one, which is to say that if a DAC has balanced outputs, in 99.9% of times, the balanced outputs will sound as good as the DAC can sound. Sometimes the RCA outputs will be equally as good as the balanced outputs. Other times, the RCA may not be quite as good. I don't think I've ever heard a DAC with both balanced and unbalanced XLR and RCA where the RCA sounded better than the XLR. The key takeaway here though is that there's no specific guaranteed benefit from having balanced connections in a home audio system. A great DAC with RCA connections only will sound better than a lesser DAC even if it's got balanced connections. A great example of that is the Chord Cutest DAC. It's only got RCA connections, but it's one of the best, if not the best DACs at and a bit above its price. So the summary here is to probably use XLR outputs if they're available, but don't feel like you need to avoid RCA outputs. That's because they're often as good as the XLR outputs, and on a device that's designed only with RCA, they can be even better. And now before we wrap up with just a few little nuances to think about when you're setting your DAC up and looking in the menu system, let's briefly talk about DACs that have headphone outputs as well. Some DACs, like this one from Xduo, have a headphone amp built in. In these cases, the headphone amp built in is often not quite as good as a standalone separate headphone amp, but again, that's not a hard and fast rule. I'll do a separate video where I'll cover all the ins and outs of headphone amps, what the different connection types are and which ones are better or worse, but the same rules or lack of rules apply to the outputs on the front of DACs as from the back. In other words, balanced connections are often better, but there's no guarantee that they'll always be better. And you definitely shouldn't prioritize a DAC with a balanced headphone output just because it's got a balanced headphone output, because there could be a similarly priced option with unbalanced headphone output only that sounds as good or better than the one with the balanced headphone output. It's about the quality of the internal circuits used, not the connection type used. And so let's leave the outputs there. Let's assume you've got your DAC connected to the source, which is the incoming digital information, and it's got an output taking the analog information off to your speakers or your headphones. And so let's wrap up now with just a few more little things you might want to think about. Some of these things might also influence which DAC you choose in the first place. So this is kind of a top and tail thing. It's something you want to think about when you've got your DAC set up, but consider some of these items as features you might want to consider when choosing which DAC to buy in the first place. Remember I said before that Delta Sigma DACs have filters, and those filters are really important in the sound of the DAC? Well, some of these DACs will let you choose which filters you use. What's important to know though is that the choice of filters makes a very tiny change once you get to this point. Choosing from the filter options available in the menu of the DAC will make very subtle shifts in things like the sense of attack and the sense of soundstage size and space that a DAC's going to deliver. But they're very subtle shifts and they're going to be inaudible to many people. Basically, the manufacturer has already made the big decisions about filtering, and so anything they're giving you is going to sound as good as they expect their device to sound. What you're then able to do is just play around the edges to make a tiny tweak here or a tiny tweak there. They won't alter the general qualities of the DAC. Another common feature in modern DACs is that many of them let you choose between a line-out mode and a preamp mode. What this means is that the DAC can output at full volume to an external preamp or headphone amp or an integrated amp, or it can let you control the volume via the controls on the DAC. Having a volume control on the DAC is fantastic if you want to connect it directly to a power amp where there is no volume control, or to a pair of active speakers where there also might be no volume control. However, if you're connecting to a headphone amp, a preamp, or an integrated amp that's got the volume control, you'll be best putting the DAC in line-out mode, which will maximize its volume output and deliver the maximum level out to the next device. This helps to reduce the audibility of any noise in the system and makes it simpler by only having one volume control to worry about. If the DAC doesn't have a line-out mode, like this one doesn't, then all you need to do is turn the volume up to the maximum setting on a DAC like this one, and you're getting the same benefit. And that's it. I know it was actually a lot. Hopefully your brain is still intact and this has made some sense. To help with that, let me give you one last summary really fast. Firstly, there is no single correct approach to decoding the files to turn them into sound waves. So you should check reviews, chat to people, and ideally audition some DACs for yourself to work out what you tend to like. Next, even if you have a preference for a certain style of DAC, such as R2R or Delta Sigma, remember that from one model to the next, even within the same brand, they can sound different. So remember to double check before you go and buy one. Just because it's R2R or Delta Sigma doesn't mean that that particular DAC is going to sound like the other R2R or Delta Sigma DAC you heard. When it comes to inputs, remember that any type of input other than Bluetooth is going to deliver a pretty comparable sound. But it's also worth trying the options you have available to you because one of them might sound a bit better. And then finally, if a DAC does offer XLR outputs, they're probably going to sound the best, but don't be afraid to use RCA connections because they're generally excellent, and if the DAC is RCA only, you shouldn't see that as a negative. As a reminder, a great RCA only DAC can sound better than a lesser quality XLR based DAC. And then once you've thought about all those things and factored those into your decisions, have a play, try the settings, see what you like, and don't worry about what might be right or wrong based on what somebody else says because nobody actually knows what's right and wrong. It's all subjective. Music is subjective and we all hear differently, so all that matters is what you enjoy. And I hope this has helped you to understand DACs a bit better. If there's anything from this that you don't yet get, or that maybe I haven't covered in a way that you wanted me to, let me know here in the comments and I'll look to answer it on the Passion for Sound podcast. There's a link to that in the description, and it's a way that I'm starting to respond to common comments, common themes, or something interesting that I see come up in the comments. And next, if you want to better understand what matters in the devices that deliver the digital audio into your DAC, in other words, the stuff that comes before the DAC, watch this video next where I explain what transports are and why they're probably the most important part of your hi-fi system. For now though, thank you to YouTube channel members, thank you to channel Patreon members, and thank you to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you again soon on Passion for Sound.